The grit of the rock face was a cruel sandpaper against her palms, scraping skin away with every upward pull. Rowan's breath came in ragged, burning bursts, each one a small victory against the screaming protest of her muscles. The weight on her back was a living thing, a sack of precious, terrified life that shifted and whimpered with every precarious move. Inside the heavy canvas knapsack, Bramble, her only family, whined softly, his warm body a constant, trembling reminder of what she stood to lose. Below, the world she was escaping had shrunk to a patchwork of dusty browns and tired greens, a place ruled by straight lines and the cold geometry of control. Up here, on the sheer face of the Whisperwind Peaks, there was only the raw, vertical truth of the mountain. The wind tried to pry her fingers from their holds, a mournful howl that spoke of long falls and splintered bone. She ignored it. Fear was a luxury, a fire that consumed precious fuel, and she had none to spare. Her focus narrowed to the next handhold, a shallow crack just above her head, and then the next foothold, a miserable nub of granite barely wide enough for the toe of her worn boot. This was the final ascent, the last barrier to the one place she had been told never to go. The forbidden ravine. A place spoken of in hushed, fearful tones back at the Sterling foundling home, a place of shadows, beasts, and bad air where no sane person would venture. To Rowan, it sounded like freedom. She pressed her cheek against the cold stone, the mineral scent of it filling her nostrils. It smelled of deep time and indifference, a welcome antidote to the cloying, antiseptic scent of the home. One last heave. Her fingers, raw and bleeding, found purchase on the lip of the precipice. She kicked, scrambled, and clawed her way over the edge, collapsing onto a bed of pine needles and moss, her chest heaving as she dragged the thin, high-altitude air into her lungs. She lay there for a long moment, the world spinning, before carefully shrugging the knapsack from her shoulders. Bramble scrambled out, a mess of black and tan fur, and immediately began licking the blood from her hands, his soft tongue a stark contrast to the unforgiving rock. She stroked his head, her gaze lifting to the sight before them. The ravine opened up like a great, green wound in the earth, far deeper and vaster than she had imagined. A river of mist coiled through its bottom, obscuring whatever lay in the depths. Ancient pines, bearded with moss, clung to its steep sides. The air was different here, it was thick, alive, and utterly silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the high branches. It was a place untouched, a world apart. A sanctuary. Or a tomb. At 18, Rowan couldn't tell the difference, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would rather die here, free, than live another day under his roof. That was yesterday. Now, a fragile dawn painted the eastern rim of the ravine in hues of rose and pale gold, but the light barely penetrated the dense canopy above her makeshift camp. The memory of her escape was a fresh bruise, tender to the touch. It wasn't the grueling work or the threadbare blankets of the Sterling foundling home that had finally broken her. It was the quiet, calculated cruelty of the man who gave the institution its name. Mr. Sterling. He never raised his voice. He moved with a liquid grace, his suits always immaculate, his silver-tipped cane tapping a gentle, rhythmic beat on the polished floors. His power wasn't in brute force, but in the slow, systemic erosion of hope. He believed in order, in productivity, in turning orphan children into pliant, useful cogs for his various enterprises, the mill, the quarry, the vast tracts of land he was methodically acquiring. He would walk the dormitory aisles at night, not to comfort, but to observe, his eyes cataloguing every soul like inventory. Rowan had learned early to become invisible, to work harder and speak less than anyone else, to build a wall of silent competence around herself. Bramble, a stray pup she'd found half-starved behind the kitchens 2 years ago, was the only crack in that wall. He was her secret, her warmth in the cold nights, the one living thing that saw her as more than a pair of hands. The day it all shattered began with a simple act of kindness. One of the younger boys, barely 6, had fallen and torn the knee of his only trousers. Rowan had stayed up late, using a precious needle and thread she'd scavenged, to mend the tear so he wouldn't be punished. Mr. Sterling saw the repaired garment the next morning. He called Rowan to his office, a place that smelled of leather and ledgers. He didn't mention the trousers. Instead, he smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. It has come to my attention, he began, his voice smooth as polished river stone, that you are harboring an animal. A drain on resources. Unhygienic. An element of chaos in an orderly system. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes and his smile widened. I am a reasonable man, Rowan. I admire initiative. But loyalty must be to the collective, not to a sentimental attachment. The dog will be removed by noon. Consider it a lesson in practicality. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. There was no appeal, no negotiation. To him, Bramble was a stray number on a balance sheet, and the balance was in the red. The look in his eyes held no anger, only a chilling, detached sense of correctness. He wasn't just taking her dog, he was teaching her that love was a liability. That was when she knew she had to run. Not just for Bramble, but for the last, flickering ember of her own soul. Packing was an act of quiet desperation, a stale loaf of bread, a small tin of water, a blanket, and the knapsack she had secretly reinforced for this very purpose. She had left in the deepest hour of the night, with Bramble nestled silently on her back, choosing the forbidden mountain over the suffocating order of a man who would quantify a life and find it wanting. The first days in the ravine were a blur of primal needs. Thirst was a constant, rasping companion. The mist-choked floor of the chasm offered dampness but no clear water, forcing her to lick dew from broad leaves and press handfuls of moss against her lips for the meager moisture they held. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache in her belly, a hollow space the wild berries she found, sour, unfamiliar things she tested with cautious nibbles, could not fill. She and Bramble moved like ghosts through the ancient woods, a silent pact of survival between them. She was the mind, he was the senses. His ears, perked and swiveling, caught the snap of a twig long before she did. His nose sifted the complex tapestry of scents, alerting her to the musky passage of deer and the sharp, territorial odor of something larger she had no desire to meet. Fear was the sharpest sensation of all, a cold stone in her gut. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like the footfalls of Sterling's men. She knew he would not let her defiance go unanswered. Not because he cared about her, but because she was a loose thread in his perfect tapestry, an asset that had absconded. Her escape was an act of rebellion, and he could not permit rebellion to be seen as a viable option for the others. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate. Shelter. She found it on the third day, a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of cascading ivy on the western slope, high above the damp floor. It was little more than a scooped-out hollow in the rock, but it was dry and defensible. She spent hours clearing it of loose stones and debris, her raw hands aching with the effort. She gathered fallen branches, stripping them of their leaves to create a thick, insulated bed in the driest corner. It was a den, not a home, but as she watched Bramble curl up on the makeshift mattress, letting out a contented sigh, a fragile sense of accomplishment bloomed in her chest. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She had provided. Here, in this wild, vertical world, she was not a foundling or a number. She was a survivor. She established a routine born of necessity. Mornings were for scouting, for finding the thin trickles of seepage that provided their water, for marking the locations of berry patches and edible roots she recognized from a tattered almanac she'd once memorized. Afternoons were for improving the shelter, for gathering firewood, for being still and listening to the rhythms of the ravine. In the evenings, they would huddle together for warmth as the temperature plummeted, the vast, star-dusted sky a terrifying and beautiful ceiling. It was a hard, spare existence, but it was hers. Every drop of water, every mouthful of food, was earned. The silence was profound, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the distant rumble of a rock slide. It was a silence that allowed her to hear her own thoughts for the first time, free from the constant hum of the home's machinery and the weight of Sterling's oppressive order. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She had Bramble. She had herself. And for now, that was enough. The offering appeared on the fifth morning. It was placed on a flat stone just outside the curtain of ivy that concealed her cave, a small, carefully wrapped parcel of oilcloth tied with twine. Rowan's heart hammered against her ribs. She froze, her hand instinctively going to Bramble's neck to keep him silent. Her first thought was a trap. Sterling's men. They had found her. They were playing with her, luring her out. She stayed hidden for what felt like an eternity, scanning the dense woods around her, her eyes searching for any flicker of unnatural movement, any glint of a spy scope or rifle barrel. Nothing. The ravine remained still, indifferent. The silence was absolute. Bramble whined, his nose twitching, smelling the contents of the parcel. The scent of smoked meat, rich and tantalizing, drifted into the cave, making her stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was painful. Slowly, cautiously, she crept forward. She used a long stick to poke at the package, half expecting it to trigger a snare. When nothing happened, she nudged it closer, her movements furtive as a fox. Her fingers trembled as she untied the twine. Inside were 3 thick strips of dried venison and a small bundle of pungent, broad-leafed herbs she recognized as a fever reducer. It was a gift of life. But from whom? A trapper? Another runaway? The gesture was too deliberate, too knowing. The placement was precise, close enough to be found but not so close as to reveal her exact hiding spot. Whoever it was, they knew she was here. They had been watching her. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, but it was different this time, mingled with a profound sense of confusion. Sterling's men would not leave gifts. They would come with nets and ropes. This was something else entirely. She spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alert, her senses stretched to their breaking point. She saw no one. She heard nothing. But the feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, was undeniable. That evening, she shared a strip of the venison with Bramble, the rich, salty flavor an explosion on her tongue after days of nothing but bland roots and sour berries. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She saved the other 2 pieces, rationing them, hoarding this impossible kindness. Far above her, on a high ledge overlooking the western slope, an old man watched the faint wisp of smoke from her carefully concealed fire. Jedediah lowered his spy scope, his knuckles white as he gripped the worn brass. He had seen the girl and her dog days ago, a flash of movement where none should be. He had watched her struggle, her fierce determination a painful echo of a past he had spent decades trying to forget. He knew who she was running from. Everyone who lived in the shadow of the peaks knew of Sterling and his cold charity. Jedediah also knew why the ravine was forbidden. He was the reason. He had failed this place once before, had stood by in silent cowardice as Sterling had twisted the truth for his own gain. He was too old, too broken to fight the man head-on. But he could leave a parcel of food. He could offer a small, anonymous measure of aid. It was a coward's penance, he knew, but it was a start. He had watched her find the parcel, had seen her terror and her caution. She was smart. She was a survivor. And for the first time in 30 years, the guilt that sat like a stone in his chest felt a fraction lighter. The surveyor found her by accident. His name was Arthur, and he was not like the other men Sterling employed. He was quiet, methodical, his face etched with a sorrow that had nothing to do with his work. He was charting the upper tributaries of the ravine's main creek, a task he performed with a detached precision that masked a deep and abiding weariness. He was following a barely there game trail when he pushed aside a thicket of ferns and found himself standing 20 feet from her cave. The confrontation was a silent, heart-stopping tableau. Rowan, who had been scraping a root with a sharp piece of flint, shot to her feet. Bramble, sensing her alarm, instantly moved in front of her, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. Arthur froze, his hands held up in a placating gesture. He saw not a wild thing, but a girl, barely a woman, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with a fierce, cornered animal terror. He saw the raw knuckles, the thin frame, the protective stance she took over the dog. His gaze flickered from the girl to the dog and back again, and in that moment, something shifted in his expression. The professional detachment crumbled, replaced by a flicker of profound, personal pain. He had a dog once. He'd had a daughter, too. Both were gone now, taken by the fever that had swept through the lower town 2 winters ago, a fever born of bad water and a powerful man's indifference. He worked for Sterling because he needed the money, but he hated the man with a quiet, burning intensity. He saw Sterling's brand of casual cruelty reflected in the girl's desperate eyes. He lowered his hand slowly. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice soft, careful not to spook her. Rowan didn't move. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her piece of flint. She said nothing, her silence a wall. She was calculating. Could she run? Could she fight? He was bigger, stronger. But she had the advantage of terrain, of desperation. Arthur took a slow step back, putting more distance between them. He unslung his own satchel and set it on the ground. "I'm just surveying the creek," he explained, his voice even. For Mr. Sterling the name hung in the air between them, a shared poison. He saw the recognition, the hardening of her gaze. He knew then, without a doubt, that she was one of the runaways from the home. He should report her. It was his duty. It would earn him a small bonus, a nod of approval from his employer. But all he could see was his own daughter's face, her small hand in his as the fever took her. He saw the loyalty of the dog she protected, a mirror of the loyal companion he had buried beside his child. He made a decision. It was small, quiet, but it felt like shifting a mountain. "He doesn't need to know I was here," Arthur said. "And I was never here." He backed away slowly, never turning his back on her until he was swallowed by the ferns. Rowan stood frozen for a long time after he was gone, the flint still clutched in her hand. An hour later, as dusk began to settle, she found a small, tightly wrapped bundle at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't been there before. Inside was a pouch of potent salve for her hands and a small packet of quinine powder for fever. He had seen more than she realized. He had seen her raw hands, had considered the possibility of sickness. It was a gesture of profound empathy, a lifeline from the last place she ever expected to find one. For the second time, she was the recipient of an impossible kindness in a place that was supposed to be empty of it. The sky had been a bruised purple for 2 days, the air growing thick and heavy, charged with an oppressive stillness. The storm broke just after midnight. It was not a gentle rain but a violent assault, a raw display of the mountain's power. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered the canopy and turned the forest floor into a churning river of mud and debris. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a percussive blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of the rock, and lightning bleached the world in stark, terrifying flashes of white. Rowan and Bramble huddled in the deepest part of their cave, but it offered little protection. Water found its way through a dozen unseen fissures in the rock, streaming down the walls, pooling on the floor, soaking their bed of branches until it was a sodden, freezing mat. A torrent of runoff, diverted by a fallen log upstream, began pouring over the ivy curtain, turning their shelter into a miserable, waterlogged grotto. The temperature plummeted. Rowan wrapped the one thin, damp blanket around them both, her body shivering uncontrollably as she tried to shield Bramble from the worst of the cold. By dawn, the storm had lessened to a steady, miserable drizzle, but the damage was done. Their small stockpile of dried roots and berries was a pulpy, ruined mess. Their firewood was soaked beyond use. And Bramble was sick. He had begun shivering violently during the night, and now he lay listless, his breathing shallow and ragged. When he tried to stand, his legs trembled and gave out. He refused the water she offered, turning his head away with a low moan. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Rowan's exhaustion. She had faced hunger, fear, and solitude, but this was different. This was a helplessness that threatened to swallow her whole. Bramble was her anchor, her reason. Without him, the will to survive felt brittle, fragile. She touched his nose, it was hot and dry. Fever. The quinine powder Arthur had left. She mixed a small amount with water, prying Bramble's jaws open and gently pouring the bitter liquid down his throat. He coughed and sputtered, but he swallowed it. Now, all she could do was wait. But the cave was no longer safe. It was a cold, damp tomb that would surely kill him. They had to move. They had to find somewhere dry, somewhere higher. She remembered seeing smoke, days ago, from a ledge far up the ravine's northern slope. It was a desperate gamble, a choice between the unknown danger of a stranger and the certain death of staying put. With a surge of adrenaline, she packed what little she had left, the last strip of venison, the salve, the quinine. She carefully lifted Bramble, his body limp and heavier than ever, and settled him into the knapsack. His weak groan was a knife in her heart. She pushed aside the sodden ivy curtain and stepped out into a changed world. The ravine was wounded, scarred by the storm. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and broken pine. Her path was gone, washed away. She would have to climb. The ascent was a nightmare. The rocks were slick with rain and moss, offering treacherous handholds. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her back down into the ravaged chasm. Every step was a battle. Bramble's weight felt immense, a deadening anchor that strained her back and shoulders to their limits. His ragged breathing was a constant, desperate rhythm against her ear. Twice, her foot slipped, sending a shower of loose shale clattering into the depths and her heart leaping into her throat. She pressed on, driven by a singular, primal purpose. The image of the smoke was burned into her mind, a beacon of last resort. It took her hours, a grueling, vertical journey that left her body screaming in protest. Finally, she hauled herself over a final ledge and onto a flat, relatively dry plateau. There, nestled amongst a stand of weathered pines, was a small, crudely built hut, a thin plume of smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was real. She had made it. She stumbled towards the door, her legs shaking with exhaustion. She didn't have the strength to knock. She collapsed against the rough-hewn wood, the knapsack sliding from her shoulders and landing with a soft thud on the ground beside her. The door creaked open. An old man stood there, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, startled blue. It was Jedediah. He looked from Rowan's mud-caked, desperate face to the whimpering dog in the sack, and the caution in his eyes was replaced by a look of weary recognition. He had been waiting for her. "Get him inside," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. He helped her carry Bramble into the one-room hut. It was warm and dry, smelling of wood smoke and pine resin. He laid the dog gently on a worn bearskin rug near the hearth. While Rowan stripped off her wet outer layers, Jedediah examined Bramble with surprising gentleness, his gnarled fingers probing for broken bones, his ear pressed against the dog's chest. "Lungs are full," he muttered. "Bad fever." He moved with a sudden, decisive energy, fetching blankets, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, and brewing a pungent tea on the fire. He showed Rowan how to dribble the warm liquid into Bramble's mouth. They worked together in a strange, unspoken partnership. Later that day, as Bramble slept a fitful, medicated sleep, Arthur arrived. He looked haggard, his clothes soaked. He'd come back to check on her after the storm, fearing the worst. His relief at finding her safe was palpable. He carried a pack filled with provisions, salted pork, flour, a small block of salt, and more medicine. The three of them sat around the small wooden table in Jedediah's hut, the storm-ravaged ravine falling into twilight outside. The silence was broken by Jedediah. "Sterling's planning on damming the Red Creek Fork," he said, his voice low. "The one that feeds the town. He's doing it upstream, on his own property." Arthur nodded grimly. "That's why he sent me in here. He's not just looking for tributaries. He's looking for a new water source to sell back to the very people he's cutting off. This ravine spring. It's pure. And he wants to own it." Rowan listened, a cold dread seeping into her. This was bigger than her, bigger than one runaway girl and her dog. Sterling wasn't just cruel, he was a predator, and the entire town was his prey. He told everyone this place was poisoned, Jedediah continued, his eyes dark with ancient guilt. "Years ago, there was a rockslide, mudded the spring for a season. One man got sick. Sterling used it. He bought up the surrounding land for pennies, declared the whole ravine off limits for the public good. I knew it was a lie. I was a prospector then. I knew the water was clean. But I said nothing. I was afraid of him." The confession hung in the small hut, heavy and bitter. In that moment, Rowan saw that they were all runaways, in their own way. she was running from the home. Arthur was running from his grief. And Jedediah was running from his own cowardice. The ravine had brought them together. It had become their sanctuary, and now it was their battlefield. The plan formed in the flickering firelight of Jedediah's hut, a desperate strategy woven from 3 disparate threads of knowledge. Jedediah, the keeper of the past, brought forth his memories. He spoke of the ravine's true history, of the clear, life-giving spring that had been the heart of the valley long before Sterling had arrived and painted it as a place of poison and peril. From a dusty, locked chest, he retrieved a set of old, hand-drawn maps and journals, their pages brittle with age. They detailed the geology of the area, the flow of the water table, and, most importantly, a signed affidavit from the town's original doctor, dated 30 years prior, declaring the spring water perfectly potable just weeks after the rockslide Sterling had used as his pretext. It was a truth Jedediah had buried, both literally and figuratively, out of fear. Arthur, the man of the present, provided the enemy's tactics. He unrolled his own surveyor's charts on the table, the crisp, precise lines a stark contrast to Jedediah's faded sketches. He pointed to the discrepancies, the subtle alterations Sterling had ordered. He had me falsify the water flow readings, Arthur admitted, his voice tight with self-loathing. These charts show the spring as a minor, seasonal trickle, not the year-round source it is. And this, he pointed to a section of the map high above the town, is where the new dam is being constructed. It's nearly complete. Once the gates are closed, the town's creek will be reduced to a muddy stream within a week. He then produced a schedule. Sterling had planned a town meeting in 3 days' time. He would present himself as the town's savior, magnanimously offering to pipe in clean water from his newly discovered source in the ravine, for a steep price, of course. He would be hailed as a hero for solving a crisis of his own creation. Rowan, the catalyst for the future, provided the courage. She listened to it all, her initial fear solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. She had seen the direct result of Sterling's manipulations in the hungry faces at the home, in his willingness to destroy her bond with Bramble for the sake of order. Now she saw the full scale of his ambition. He wasn't just controlling a few dozen orphans, he was holding an entire town hostage. He needs them to be afraid, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the men's grim analysis. He needs them to believe his story about this place. We have to show them the truth. The strategy was simple and perilous. They would confront him at the meeting. Jedediah, the ghost of the town's past, would speak first, his testimony breaking 30 years of fearful silence. Arthur would follow, using his surveyor's maps, both the falsified ones and his own secret, corrected copies, to provide undeniable proof of the deception. And Rowan? She would be the living evidence. The girl who had not only survived in the poisoned ravine but had thrived, her presence a direct contradiction to the lie Sterling had built his power upon. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. While Jedediah coached himself, whispering his long-rehearsed confession to the crackling fire, and Arthur meticulously prepared his presentation, Rowan cared for Bramble. Under their combined care, the dog was slowly recovering. The fever broke, and he began to take food, his tail giving a weak but hopeful thump against the floorboards. His healing became a quiet symbol of their own. Each spoonful of broth she fed him felt like an act of defiance, a nurturing of the very sentiment Sterling had tried to extinguish. On the morning of the 3rd day, Bramble stood on his own 4 feet, shaky but steady. Rowan knelt and hugged him, burying her face in his thick fur. He was alive. They were alive. And now, it was time to fight. The town hall was packed, a sea of anxious, weary faces lit by the warm glow of oil lamps. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and simmering fear. Mr. Sterling stood at the front, a paragon of calm authority beside a large, covered easel. He was in his element, a shepherd tending to his flock, his voice a soothing balm of concern and control. He spoke of the unfortunate, unforeseen drought, of the dwindling creek, of the hardships to come. He painted a grim picture, his words carefully chosen to cultivate a sense of shared crisis, a crisis only he had the foresight to solve. "But I come to you not with problems," he said, his tone shifting to one of magnanimous revelation, "but with a solution. A project I have personally funded for the health and prosperity of us all." He gestured to his assistant, who dramatically unveiled the map on the easel. It was Arthur's falsified chart, showing a grand, benevolent plan to pipe water from the mountains. A murmur of relief and gratitude rippled through the crowd. "The doors of this hall are barred," a voice called out, sharp and clear. Every head turned. Standing in the center aisle, her silhouette framed by the last light of day streaming through the entrance she had just unbarred, was Rowan. She was clean, her hair brushed, wearing a simple dress Jedediah's late wife had left behind. She looked not like a wild runaway, but like a determined young woman. Beside her stood Arthur, his face pale but resolute, a roll of charts under his arm. And behind them both, his hand trembling slightly on the doorframe, was Jedediah. A collective gasp went through the room. Sterling's composure barely flickered, but a dangerous coldness entered his eyes. "An interruption," he said smoothly. "A troubled girl from the home. She is clearly unwell." But before he could continue, Jedediah stepped forward. "She ain't the one who's unwell, Sterling," the old man's voice cracked, but it carried across the silent room. "The sickness is the lies you've been feeding in this town for 30 years." He began to speak, his words stumbling at first, then gaining strength as he unburdened his soul. He told them of the rock slide, of the clean spring, of the fear that had kept him quiet. Arthur stepped forward next, unrolling his own true maps. He laid them over Sterling's, the discrepancies stark and damning. He explained the dam, the manufactured water shortage, the calculated profiteering. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, angrier. Doubt was taking root. Sterling laughed, a condescending, dismissive sound. The ravings of a senile prospector and a disgruntled employee, aided by a delinquent. "You have no proof. I am the proof," Rowan said, her voice steady. "I have lived in that poisoned ravine for weeks. I drank its water. I ate its food. It is not a place of death. It is a place of life." The final blow came from the one person no one expected. Eleanora Sterling, who had been sitting silently in the front row, rose to her feet. Her face was a mask of pale, tragic composure. "He is lying," she said, her voice quiet but piercing the hall. 30 years ago, our own son, our Thomas, died of the creek fever. The doctor told my husband the water source was tainted by his new quarry upstream. He told him to warn the town. Instead, her voice broke, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He bought the land around the clean spring and created his story about the ravine. He let others get sick. He let our own son's memory be a lie to protect his profits. A profound, horrified silence fell over the room. It was not the maps or the testimony of outcasts that broke him. It was the intimate, undeniable truth from the woman who stood by his side. His polished veneer shattered, revealing the hollow, ruthless man beneath. His power, built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, crumbled to dust in a matter of moments. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet, seismic change. Sterling was gone. He did not face a court or a jail cell. His wealth and influence provided him a shield against such tidy conclusions. Instead, he simply vanished one night, his grand house left empty, his assets quietly liquidated by men from the city. He was a ghost, his name suddenly a curse on the lips of the people who had once revered him. His departure left a vacuum, but not one of chaos. Instead, something tentative and new began to grow in its place. The town council, long a rubber stamp for Sterling's ambitions, was forced to actually govern. They sent a delegation to the ravine, guided by Arthur, to see the spring for themselves. They drank the clear, cold water and saw the truth of the deception. The dam was halted. The Sterling foundling home was placed under the town's own administration, its harsh rules relaxed, its purpose shifting from producing labor to caring for children. A sense of collective ownership, of shared responsibility, began to settle over the valley. People started talking to each other again, not as employees or tenants of a single powerful man, but as neighbors. For Rowan, the change was more personal. She did not return to the home. She had no desire to live within walls, no matter how benevolent. Her place was the ravine, the wild sanctuary that had saved her. Jedediah, his conscience finally clear, deeded her a small, sun-drenched parcel of his land near the mouth of the spring. It wasn't a gift, it was, he said, a restitution. Together, the three of them, the girl who had learned to trust, the man who had found his purpose, and the elder who had reclaimed his honor, began to build. They cleared the small plot of land, their hands working the rich, dark earth. They weren't building a farm to turn a profit, they were planting a garden. Arthur, who had quit his surveying job the day after the meeting, worked with a quiet joy Rowan had never seen in him. He showed her how to read the soil, how to plant in rows that followed the contours of the land. Jedediah, his knowledge of the mountains vast, taught her which plants would thrive in the high-altitude sun. There was an unspoken understanding between Rowan and Arthur. It wasn't a romance born of high drama, but something quieter, deeper. It was built in the shared work of turning over soil, in the comfortable silences as they watched the sunset paint the ravine walls, in the mutual respect for the scars they both carried. He understood her need for space, her deep-seated distrust of being controlled. He never pushed, never presumed. He was simply there, a steady, reliable presence. Eleanor Sterling visited once. She came on foot, dressed simply, her face stripped of its former aristocratic hauteur. She brought with her a small box. Inside was a leather-bound book on botany and a set of quality gardening tools. She said little, but her eyes, when they met Rowan's, were filled with a complex mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "He took my son's life and turned it into a lie," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You gave his memory a piece of the truth back." She did not stay long, and Rowan never saw her again. It was a final, quiet closing of a painful chapter. One afternoon, as the first green shoots were beginning to push their way through the soil, Rowan sat on a warm boulder, watching Bramble. He was no longer the sickly, shivering creature from the storm. He was healthy, his coat thick and glossy, his body lean and strong. He was chasing a yellow butterfly, leaping and pouncing with an exuberant joy that was infectious. The grave she had feared she was digging for him had become a garden. The struggle was not over. The coming winter would be hard, and the town's future was still uncertain. But for the first time in her life, Rowan felt the firm bedrock of hope beneath her feet. She was not a lone survivor anymore. She was part of something, a small, unlikely community forged in defiance and nurtured by the clear, clean water of the forbidden ravine. She was home,